Good afternoon, everyone. We are now on the final stretch of this year's International Conference on Geographical Studies, which will see a book forum featuring Dr. Christian Sagin's newly published book entitled Urban Ecologies on the Edge, Making Metro Manila's, or should I say, Making Manila's Resource Frontier. My name is Timothy James Cipriano, a PGS board member and the co-coordinator of this year's ICGS, and I will be your moderator for this book forum. Before we officially begin our program, I would like to go over some house rules for this session. Please be reminded to keep your microphones on mute during the presentation to avoid unnecessary background noise. Our forum will be simultaneously streamed in the UP Department of Geography YouTube channel. We would like to encourage everyone to participate in our discussion by typing in your questions, comments, or reactions through Slido. Instructions on how to do that will be provided once we get to the open forum portion of the program. Also, please note that this session is being recorded for documentation purposes. In addition, before we end the meeting, we'll be requesting our participants, if possible, to turn on their respective cameras for a group photo. Now, moving on to our program. I wish to introduce our speaker, who happened to be my former thesis advisor, and whose work has shaped mine as a geographer, especially on his provocations on the processes of urbanization and how it shapes and produces risks and vulnerabilities within and beyond the city. Christian Carlos Sagin is an associate professor of geography at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, whose work cuts across urban, agrarian, and environmental studies. He has published political ecological research that examines livelihoods, resource governance, and everyday urban politics amid environmental change at the peri-urban interface in the Philippines in various geography, urban studies, and other interdisciplinary journals. His book, Urban Ecologies on the Edge, Making Manila's Resource Frontier, was recently published by the University of California Press in 2022. He's currently working on several projects that explore various urban and environmental issues in and around Metro Manila, including urban agriculture, smart urbanism, urban infrastructure and reclamation, density and wastes, and counter mapping in the city. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Christian Sagin as he gives a background on his book.
Okay, thanks, TJ. Let me just share my screen. Right. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today at the tail end of this week and at the very last event of the International Conference in Geographical Studies. My name is Christian Carlos Sagin from the Department of Geography, University of the Philippines. And for the next 15 minutes, I wanted to kind of give a brief introduction of the book and its major arguments. And first, let me say that this book is, of course, a product of many years of work that involved a whole host of people who have made it possible, from places like Diliman to Laguna Lake to Texas. And I'm extremely grateful to those who have been part of its journey over the last decade. I would also like to thank the Philippine Geographical Society and the UP Department of Geography, those who are here today, for organizing this forum and also a launch the book. And to our discussants who will hear later, Marvin and Tim, for agreeing to be part of today's panel. So as you can see from the book's title, I will be talking about Manila's urban edge. Let me begin by talking about two socio-ecological stories. Perhaps some of you might be familiar with aspects of them from across this edge. The first is about floods. On the morning of September 26, 2009, thousands in Metro Manila woke up to a sudden surge of floodwaters after hours of nonstop rain drenched the city. The tropical disturbance responsible for this record rainfall, Undoy, was a minor storm, but drew a month's worth of monsoon rains over a 6-hour period. Manila's waterways failed to contain the excess stormwater from upstream, bursting their banks and unexpectedly inundating homes with water and mud. While images of catastrophe in the city circulated and dissipated over the next few days, those who lived along the shoreline of Laguna Lake, also called Laguna de Bay, to the city's southeast, had to endure flooding for several more weeks. Water that the city could not accommodate had been diverted to the lake, which rose to levels not seen in at least 4 decades. The lake's forgotten role in Metro Manila's flood control scheme as storage space for excess stormwater built in the 20th century quickly seeped into the public imagination again. Explanations for both the disaster and solutions to avert future flash flooding in the city required considering the central place of the lake in making and maintaining urban flood control infrastructure. The second story is about fish. In 2013, a lakeside town to Manila Southeast celebrated its annual fiesta by hosting an unusual culinary contest where competing chefs were tasked to create recipes for knifefish, an exotic fish that had accidentally found and ate its way into the lake from urban aquariums in Metro Manila. The carnivorous predator posed a serious threat to commercial aquaculture in the lake, an industry introduced 4 decades earlier to improve fish production and meet urban demand for cheap protein. Aquaculture enclosures eventually took hold in the lake's landscape, a contentious, transformative, and sometimes violent process, and established a lake economy that supplied fish to the urban markets. The highly invasive knifefish became a costly pest for many aquaculture producers, wiping out stock milkfish inside enclosures and undermining a productive fishery. The culinary contest was one of several attempts by the government to contain the invasion and reduce knifefish population by demonstrating its edibility to a skeptical public wary of consuming unfamiliar fish. The winning dish, knifefish a la cordon bleu, seen here, showed that transcending the undesirability of the bland flesh and elevating the fish body's edibility required practical and imaginative work. Fishers caught the invasive fish as a suboptimal substitute, making do with what was available in a lake, ecologically transformed by the boom and bust cycles of urban aquaculture. But due to the lack of demand in the lake, the fish had to be brought to the city, where its white flesh found use in the processing of urban street food such as fish balls. The exotic knifefish presented an unintended antithesis to farm fish deliberately introduced to improve the livelihoods of lake dwellers and supply fish for the city. That both types of fish, one an invasive pest and the other a farm commodity, ended up consumed as food in Manila, shows the close and changing socio-ecological relations between the city and the lake in urban provisioning. As urban socio-ecological stories beyond the city, the problem of floods and fish exposed urban connections that have slowly been built and maintained over time as cities expand their edges and enroll resources from elsewhere. Urban environmental trajectories are inextricably tied to their frontiers through a process that reconstitute urban rural spaces, ecologies, and lives. So taking the question of urban provisioning and what kinds of work are necessary to make and maintain these relations, I draw from diverse approaches in urban, environmental, and agrarian studies to cast light on urbanization as a frontier making process, one that brings together natures, landscapes, and peoples across space in finding geographical solutions to urban resource challenges. These overlooked beyond the city spaces like Laguna Lake are made to work to deliver vital resource flows that sustain city life. Manila, with its extended metropolitan population of more than 25 million, has been particularly plagued by two persistent urban environmental challenges amid its massive growth in the 20th century. One is feeding its appetite for food and water, the other keeping it safe from the threat of flooding, both of which underscore its intensified dependence on resource flows beyond its boundaries. Laguna Lake, a 900 square kilometer shallow and nutrient-rich freshwater lake, became an important node in state development project designs. Imagined as a convenient resource frontier, a ready and pliable source of fish and domestic water, and a sink for waste and floodwaters. As this frontier developed, techniques of simplifying, erasing, and undercounting complex lake socio-ecologies intersected with lake dwellers' practices of living amid increasing urban connections and transformations. The state introduced aquaculture in 1970 to spur regional development while supplying steady flows of cheap fish for a city amid crisis in capture fisheries. But this was not without contradiction, as aquaculture's expansion marginalized fisher folks, producers, and exposed city consumers to cheaper and more abundant, but also less desirable and perhaps more unsafe fish. Managing the stormwater function of the lake through a flood control network, mostly built in the latter half of the 20th century, enabled large-scale controlled flows to prevent flash flooding in the city, but channeled floods to the lake and magnified risk for lake dwellers in their production. Following both fish and flood waters make visible the assemblage of flows, landscapes, and infrastructures, the conditions of possibility that sustain life in the city, most dynamically found in and beyond what we can call the urban edges. So I'm thinking of, I think of the edge and use it as it invokes at least three senses, as location, relation, and condition. As a location, it refers to the urban fringe, the zone where the city dissolves into the beyond the city. As more of a continuum, it is gradual, patchwork, and ambiguous, shaped by a mix of multiple logics, characterized by often unpredictable juxtapositions. Laguna Lake sits on Metro Manila's expanding edge, the city literally stopping at the lakeshore even as its urban connections, flows, and impacts extend much beyond. As a relation, the edge also denotes limits, transitions, and liminality of being wedged between two worlds, in between the core and its margins, the city and frontiers. It reflects a spatio-temporal relation manifested in particular times and places, suggesting that the fate of places like Laguna Lake and Metro Manila are relationally imbricated to urbanization. As a condition of uncertainty, precarity, and being unsettled, the edge also suggests socio-ecological relations marked by shifts and surprises, the looming sense of being on the precipice of transforming into a different state, and a sense of undecidability and provisionality. Urban frontier making in Laguna Lake is where visions of space and material transformations reconfigure precarious lives and landscapes and redefine trajectories in often unexpected ways. So two core concepts guide the book's framing and talk a bit about both of them. So urban frontier and urban metabolism. So first, the frontier opens up possibilities for relationally understanding urban spaces transformed beyond the city. Frontiers are historically and geographically specific, denoting a dynamic spatiality produced in relation to the center as something that takes place. Frontiers are mutable and mobile as they emerge and vanish, move and return. Frontier making captures this relational dynamism, while resource frontiers signal the creative and destructive incorporation of margins into the orbit of state and capital, emerging at particular moments when a new resource becomes amenable to extraction and commodification. So they are sites where state territorial power, modern visions of order, and capital accumulation intersect with lives and landscape, producing spaces of conflicts, change, and potentialities. Urbanization, however, I argue, has often been overlooked in accounts of frontier making, yet they can be mapped onto each other as relations co-constituted by resource production and flows. An urban resource frontier promises progress and development achieved through increased integration with the city to solve its urban resource problems, often facilitated by state territorialization. In the book, I also use urban metabolism, a boundary concept in the natural and social sciences that refer to socio-ecological transformation in the city, as a lens to examine the co-production of urban natures, an inherently political process that is a product of uneven relations of power. By using flow as a metaphor for metabolism's spatial dynamics, with its implications of fluidity, movement, and circulation, I seek to disentangle the various relations and materialities that constitute the production and maintenance of flows. In the case of Laguna Lake, food, water, and waste, going beyond treating flows as merely quantifiable and physical objects. Tracking flows and urban transformations beyond the city, for example, to the multiple sites of frontier urbanism, shows that landscapes, bodies, and communities are shaped by urbanization in radical and banal ways through questions of access, power, and control in livelihoods and socio-ecological change. Frontier and flows train our attention to the specific features in these edges that are shaped by urbanization, including their imaginative, liminal, and unmapped, and lively characteristics. So here I will skip over much of the empirical detail of the book, so to give you uh, a need to read the stories in the book. So it contains around 6 chapters, weave together diverse narratives about Metro Manila and Laguna Lake, including modern state plans and imaginaries of taming frontier landscapes in the 20th century. And as I discussed in chapter 1, I'll talk about crisis in regulation of fish pens as form of capitalist enclosures amid transformed lake livelihoods in chapter 2. Chapter 3, I discuss lively materialities of resource frontiers, natures that frustrate best laid modern plans, including hazards and invasive fish. In chapter 4, I talk about access and exclusion surrounding urban commodity flows from the lake to the urban fish market. And in chapter 5, I also discuss practices of social material transformation of contradictory urban flows by using the example of one type of fish and following its biography. And in chapter 6, I talk about contested production of flood risk through flows and infrastructure. But returning to Manila and Laguna Lake and taking it back to the present day, I would like to perhaps conclude in the last 2 slides with some reflections on the futures and temporalities of a particular urban resource frontier. So what happens to a frontier indelibly transformed to deliver urban metabolic resource flows? What socio-ecological futures are imagined for a space on the urban edge if and when the commodity frontier moves on? How do imaginaries of ruination reconfigure resource frontier landscapes, and to what political effect? So in response to the floods that introduced this presentation earlier, the Philippine government promised an infrastructural solution in the form of an expressway dike that both aimed to address flooding while reclaiming more land for speculative urban development. These developments reflect the ways that the lake is viewed to reconfigure lake environments to channel particular metabolic flows with material effects on productive activities that have taken root in the lake. Imaginaries of ruination, decline, death, and decay have always been a key feature of resource frontiers as their productive capacities are exhausted or rendered obsolete. In Laguna Lake in particular, the imagination of the lake as dying, dead, polluted, and degraded continues to circulate. The silted, murky brown lake, heavily transformed for decades by human activities, has become nothing but a utilitarian landscape of resource production. So these framings often serve to justify mega projects like this dike, taking on a variety of forms, and many others, and make these interventions less contentious. In contrast, lake dwellers who continue to make a living in the lake continue to emphasize the lively and life-giving nature of the lake to oppose such projects. Ruination also serves a different political purpose as a technique to justify authoritarian interventions and exercise forms of populist political will. So the lake became such a site in 2016 when, with a strongly populist undertone, former President Rodrigo Duterte promised to bring the lake back to a past pristine state of bounty, bringing order to the lake and restoring it to its past ecological condition by ordering dismantling of aquaculture structures that have long taken root in the lake and proposing non-extractive ecotourism alternatives instead. So this view, however, have undermined the complex relations that have been built to sustain a productive lake, on which thousands of livelihoods still depend up to this day. This, as the government's infrastructure push aims to solve many of Manila's metabolic problems by building more contentious infrastructure, including extracting domestic water from the lake to meet urban needs. But one promise of a metabolic lens to urban resource frontiers is that it extends the stuff of politics, so taking us to various sites of dispossession and inequality. It entails including more political actors, potential sites for intervention, and ways of seeing. Yet, despite urbanization rolling out into spaces beyond the city, political imaginaries and socio-ecological futures are not entirely subsumed under urbanization imperatives. So frontiers are urbanizing, but these spaces cannot be reduced only to this process. Edges, after all, are sites where multiple eventualities emerge and diverge as urbanization rolls out temporally with incomplete and undecidable trajectories. The politics of edginess here, we can argue, extends beyond merely seeing urban connections, but also invites viewing these spaces as vital grounds for forging political possibilities as people attend to their livelihood needs through diverse rhythms and practices, such as in the patchwork contiguities of the often overlooked urban frontiers. So with that, I, I, I hope to have given a very brief introduction of kind of some of the major arguments of the book, and I'll be happy to talk more about details or different aspects of the book as we move along, and looking forward to the commentaries from our two panelists today. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Sagin, for sharing what we have to look forward to in your book. And again, on behalf of the Philippine Geographical Society, I would like to congratulate you on your remarkable achievement. Let us now proceed to the next part of our forum. We have two discussants who will provide their insights on the book of Dr. Sagin. Before I formally introduce them, I wish to remind that each discussant will only have 10 minutes to do so. Let me introduce our first discussant. Maria Christine or Tin Alvarez is a PhD candidate at the Bartlett Development Planning Unit of the University College London, researching resilient city making in post-Ondoy, Manila. She's the recipient of the 2018 Gilbert F. White Thesis Award from the American Association of Geographers Hazards, Risks, and Disasters Specialty Group. She also received recognition from the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research for a top-cited article for 2019 to 2020. Tin has published peer-reviewed papers in Radical Housing Journal and Journal of Urban Technology, and has a forthcoming paper in Urban Studies. Her essays have also appeared in the Funambulist, Jacobin Magazine, US and Germany, and New Left Review. To give her insights on Dr. Sagin's book, I would like to call on Tin Alvarez.
Thank you, TJ, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And I apologize that I'm unable to turn on my camera. Moving along, I'd like to first congratulate Christian on the publication of his excellent book. So for my short commentary, I will offer a brief reflection on its contributions to Philippine urban studies, as well as to the fields of urban political ecology and urban geography. I focus on contribution because this is what loomed large for me whilst reading the book. And because contribution is something I associate with Christian himself. He is one of two scholars who have made me a geographer, even though his is the one and only and the first and the last course in geography that I've taken. Obviously, this was not, a lot of time to really engage with him, but my engagements with him outside the classroom, initially as a mentor and then as a colleague, have really shaped my scholarship. From him, I've learned a new way of seeing, sensing, and thinking about cities. I owe him as well my research interest in urban political ecology. And whilst these imprints have remained with me, largely because his work has become foundational to mine, reading his book truly magnified this impact. So, Urban Ecologies on the Edge is one of the few important books that have been written on Philippine urbanization and is indeed a rich addition to the fields of urban political ecology and infrastructure studies. As a synthesis of his scholarship thus far, it also confirms my view of Christian as a key thinker, not only in Philippine critical urban studies and political ecology, but also in Philippine studies in general. We see in the book's we see this in the book's perceptive questions, thoughtful structure, rich empirics, theoretical rigor, and astute analysis. We see this too in the fresh perspectives it generates for understanding urbanization and the production of urban inequality. Further, I note 3 contributions of this work, 1 to methodology and 2 significant ones to theory. The first pertains to an organizing framework, which to me presents a methodological intervention. Flow to me is the central idea that underpins this book. It is the structure that moves the narrative, the metaphors, the ideas, and the arguments. Flow is the form that holds the structure together, that gives it coherence and lends conciseness to the analytical threads Christian strings in his work. In this sense, I think of how flow was mobilized not just as a metaphor, but also as a method for assembling the book. The second contribution is particular to city making in Manila. Using frontier as conceptual metaphor, Christian centers fish and floodwater as objects of inquiry to demonstrate the urbanization of Metro Manila as a process that creates frontiers along its fringe and facilitates urban metabolism. The third, and the most consequential in my view, is a conceptual intervention. Christian forwards the idea of the edge as an analytic for thinking through relations that entwine and mutually constitute the city and its frontier. He formulates the idea of the edge as a location, a relation, and a condition. He writes, quote, as a location, the edge refers to the urban fringe, the zone where the city dissolves into beyond the city, unquote. Then, quote, as a relation, the edge denotes limits, transitions, and liminality, unquote. Also, quote, the edge alludes to a condition of uncertainty, precarity, and being unsettled, unquote. Few concepts are as thoughtfully considered as this, and I think even fewer are as well defined, yet as capacious at the same time. And it is this capaciousness that I think gives the concept so much life force. So I guess just to wrap up my comment, I'd like to reflect a little on what these theoretical contributions mean for observing, reflecting, studying, and researching cities. To me, primarily, it invites new ways of apprehending the urban, of understanding urbanization, and approaching persistent urban problems. It also encourages us to think differently about the things we already know. Like the book turns our attention to things about the urban that we don't talk about, or to things about the urban that we do talk about. But in this manner, I think it compels us to think about the urban, the city, and the problems in more creative, in more reflexive, and in more thoughtful ways. And I think this is a really remarkable book, especially now, because there's a lot. I feel that there's a lot of creative, fresh, and perceptive thinking that's needed. It's fresh, perceptive, and creative thinking is really urgent in critical urban studies. And I think this is one of those books that do that, and that also prompt us to do the same. That's all from me. Thank you. And congratulations again, Christian.
Thank you very much, Dean, for your insights on Dr. Sagin's book. Now, let us proceed with our second discussant. He's an associate professor of social science, particularly of environmental studies at Yale NUS College in Singapore. He holds a PhD in environmental and natural resources policy in 2014 from the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, or SUNYESF. with a concurrent Master's in Public Administration degree from the Maxwell School of Syracuse University. As an interdisciplinary scholar, he employs diverse methodological approaches, ethnographic and quantitative, and draws from multiple disciplinary backgrounds, including environmental sociology, political ecology, environmental economic anthropology, STS, ecological economics, and more recently, cultural studies. His broad research agenda explores the political economy and cultural politics of historical and contemporary food issues, particularly in the context of globalization, sustainable development, and climate change. The topical areas he examined include the green or low carbon economy and its discontents, food security in development frontiers, the contradictions of alternative food systems, politics of the urban food commons, history of food waste, and agrarian implications of agritourism, all in the context of Southeast Asia. More recently, he works on a project to examine food security, vulnerability, and precarity in rural and urban communities impacted by climate change, particularly extreme weather events in the Philippines. I would like to invite Dr. Marvin Joseph Montefrio to give his insights on Dr. Sagin's book.
Hi, thank you, TJ, for that lovely introduction. Just checking, can you all hear me? Just a quick.
Yes,
right?
yes, sir.
Okay, good.
Yes.
All right. Thank you for inviting me to be part of the panel and for giving me the opportunity to discuss Christian's book. Really, it's an honor for me to share with you my own reflection on this book. And congratulations to Christian for getting it published in such a prestigious press. I do hope that there will be a co-publishing agreement with UC Press, hopefully with a local press there to further extend its reach in the Philippines. All right, so really there's a lot to celebrate about Christian's Urban Ecologies on the Edge. For one, it's one of the that bridge the urban-rural divide beyond the usual rural-urban tropes, such as the narrative of the rural to urban internal migration and the peasantization. It is the unraveling of the complexities that I admire the most about his work, something that bodes well to environmental scholars such as myself, who have been trained to appreciate such complexities. On first glance, Urban Ecologies on the Edge is a fine piece of political economic analysis. Christian details the forces of enclosure, dispossession, territorialization, and exclusion in Laguna Divide. Many of the phenomena he described are reminiscent of the terrestrial side of agrarian political economy, which reminds me a lot of the capital and state machinations in my own research sites in the agrarian uplands of Palawan and the Cordilleras, in the lowlands of the southern Tagalog and western Visayan regions. Much of the dynamics reminded me of Derek Hall, Paul Hirsch, and Tanya Lee's Powers of Exclusion, from the rendering of the lake as legible through the powers of legitimation, to the rationalization of the lake through the powers of the market and regulation, and to the more overt force and violence exercised by private fish pen owners. But these local political economy dynamics proved complicated too, with complex agrarian social relations and differentiation emerging, as many agrarian scholars such as Henry Bernstein and June Borges remind us. Moreover, Christian does a noteworthy analysis of urban political economies as he discusses labor of various forms across resource commodity chains in relation to urban poverty, precarity, and food insecurity. Christian does excellent work putting the rural and urban political economies in conversation with each other. So again, it is really the complexities that underscore the strength of urban ecologies on the edge, which is best captured in Christian's framing of resource frontiers and the edge as assemblages, the concept of assemblages bodes well with the framing of the frontier and the edge as liminal spaces. That is, spaces of uncertainty, fluctuation, and unsureness. My read is that the book draws primarily from Anna Tsing's conception of assemblages, but please allow me to frame some of Christian's arguments in the delusion and Guattarian lens as well. So what are assemblages? Assemblages denote an arrangement and or fitting together of two or more parts, a bricolage composition. They are often portrayed as multiplicitous and highly contingent on the social and historical processes in which they are situated. Assemblages are also always in flux and in the process of becoming. But it is actually the concept of emergence that makes assemblage scholarship stand out as an analytical concept. Assemblage scholars like Gilles Deleuze, Felix Guattari, and Manuel de Landa, portray assemblages as a coming together of various parts that may result in the creation of something new, an emergence, which does not equate to the sum of its parts. So hence, assemblage thinking opens up our analysis to surprises. And what do I mean by surprises? Often, when we take a strict agrarian political economy lens, there is a tendency to arrive at predictable conclusions. Territorialization, dispossessions, and exclusions become an all too familiar narrative. But many realities on the ground, while they can largely be explained by these processes, may not necessarily follow such ostensibly linear narratives. So by framing urban ecologies on the edge as an assemblage or assemblages of humans and non-humans, Christian uncovers the complexities of political economic processes. We see this when hazards such as typhoons and floods, the changing limnology of Laguna de Bay, and the introduction of invasive species temper the powers of regulation and market and provide opportunities for those who are marginalized to persist. Perhaps a simplification of this is that certain human and non-human relations within assemblages may provide openings for resistance and persistence. However, Christian does not go overboard with his assemblage thinking, as with other scholars out there who are really into assemblage scholarship. And I think that's good, because when you do so, right, there's always a risk of flattening power. And his use of assemblage thinking, in my opinion, does not completely betray his political economic analysis. He does constantly remind us that the resistance and persistence accorded by assemblage thinking should always be put in the context of a still burgeoning trend of commodification in the enduring capacity of institutions of capital to exercise fixes to address its own contradictions. Indeed, we should never forget that in spite of all the typhoons and floods in the environmental changes in Laguna de Bay, enclosures continue to expand, and new resources such as the cheap imelda or big head carp, which I really enjoyed that chapter. When these new resources become a fix to ongoing commodification and accumulation in both the resource frontier and the metropolis. I do wonder, though, to what extent Christian will push the complexification accorded by assemblages in his future analysis, if indeed he decides to continue studying the urban ecologies on the edge. If Christian were to ask me, I would encourage him to continue challenging predictable and path dependency narratives. I think there is always value in challenging the seemingly predictable and almost path-dependent narratives of many political economy analyses. Apart from just giving us a more nuanced analysis, assemblage thinking, especially from a more normative perspective, can make us be open to any form of surprises, plural, which could manifest in the form of hope. For example, I wonder if in the future, the big head carp will become more infused in the Philippine foodways and the culinary culture in the Philippines, and open doors for resistance, rather than just facilitate fixes to capitalism's contradictions. What if environmental changes in Laguna de Bay do make it more conducive for risk sharing among diffuse communities rather than concentrated among small capitalist players? Perhaps Christian might tell us a bit more about some of these possibilities. And in fact, he already did, but I wonder if there's more, right, that would kind of bring out the elements of surprises that we might associate with resistance and persistence. Being open to some of these possibilities may sound naive, but I have seen in my own work how hope can emerge from the seemingly unexpected. Sometimes I think it's good to leave openings for hope, as long as we don't abandon the political economy perspective that helps keep us on our toes. A scholarship that unravels hope can help us imagine and reimagine futures, especially in a world of increasing social and environmental anxieties. So I think I'll end here. I must say, reading and reviewing this book did help me a lot as well in thinking about my own work. This might be a shameless plug, if I may. I'm looking forward to putting Urban Ecologies on the Edge in conversation with Halo Halo Ecologies. It's an edited volume on food and environment in the Philippines that anthropologist Elisa Paredes and I are working on. It says similar tones to it, Urban Ecologies, Halo Halo Ecologies. Many of the insights Christian discussed in his book align with many of the major themes that bring our collection of chapters together. So thank you once again for giving me the opportunity to not just read, but really dive more into Christian's work. And congratulations again, Christian. I'm confident your book will get lots of recognition and awards. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Motorfio, for giving your very, very insightful commentaries on Dr. Sagin's book. I'm sure that everybody is looking forward to reading the book, given the commentaries from our two discussants this afternoon. All right, so on that note, to give his response to the discussions raised by our panelists, I'd like to call on once again Dr. Christian Sagin.
Yes, thank you so much to Tin and Marvin for their very generous comments and engagement, thinking a lot about some of the things that I've put in the book. And I'm not going to talk a lot beyond what they've already said, but just to appreciate some of the things that I've kind of learned from their brief comments. So Tin talked about kind of flow as methodology, and I think that's a very good way of describing the book as well, in terms of how the narrative flows, and also kind of how the whole project unraveled, and how it proceeded over the last few years. So a lot of the work that I've did to kind of build and complete this work really relied on thinking of flows between the city and beyond the city. So I think that very much captures some of the intentional and unintentional aspects of how the book's narrative and structure is. And yeah, thanks Tin for how you summarized the contributions of the book, and hopefully it does contribute to future studies about urban political ecology, urban environments in the Philippines. I think we are seeing significantly more interest in these kinds of fields, and hopefully a lot more books will be published in talking about different aspects of what counts as urban and ecological, and urban ecological. And Marvin, thank you. Thank you also for kind of excellent summary of the book and its approaches, and recognizing the kind of the bridging effort that I wanted to put in this book. In a way, I could say that I'm actually kind of an accidental urban scholar, because I started in rural political ecology kind of field, learning about all these agrarian political economy literature, But then when I started doing my research, I increasingly learned that I could not separate it from the urban. And so it became inevitably an urban project. And so I was thinking about how to connect these two. And so you can see tensions. There's kind of an um, an effort to try to connect them both. And I really appreciate how you frame assemblages in the book. So you are right about how um, there is it's not fully in full engagement with assemblage as a Deleuzian perhaps concept, but I took elements of it to try to frame this book, and I think I found it very useful, especially when dealing with kind of complex multiple sites, multiple actors, multiple natures, um, and how to bring them all together in kind of one narrative that makes sense and is coherent. And I think assemblage is a good way to think about that. And also what you've mentioned about emergence and surprises, I think that's one thing that I'm recently tried to be more conscious about in my own work, thinking about how could we go beyond kind of all these narratives that have been pre-rehearsed for the past few decades in the literature. So how can we try to understand, especially at the micro level and even also at the macro level, how these things produce unintended results. And I think that is one thing that I've also been thinking about. And in my recent work, especially in urban farming, urban agriculture, is thinking of it as kind of an activity that is, on the one hand, we kind of know it, but also on the other hand, it produces a lot more beyond what we expect of it. And that's what I've been trying to think through in focusing on also pushing further the idea of the edge in the state urban edge in that particular context. And I think there is some merit to exploring that concept in other cases as well. And the idea of hope is very important, I think. And also thinking about urban environments in the context of Metro Manila, there is definitely a need for hope, especially amid all the anxieties of climate change, of all the doomsday scenarios that we are experiencing. And it's perhaps there's a lot of opportunities to kind of disentangle what hope means, especially for people living in the city and how it manifests in various ways. So I really appreciate all of those provocations regarding that, and thank you very much for being in conversation with some of the elements that the book is trying to achieve. So I think Marvin and Tin, thank you so much for engagement, your engagement with the book and with the work. And there's still a lot of perhaps things that we could discuss and things that we could talk about, especially amid kind of talk about the Anthropocene, talk about climate change and the role of the city and all these things. So I think there's still much work to be done in this regard. So I'll end with that, and perhaps you could, if there are any questions or comments, and both logistical or otherwise. Okay. Okay. So TJ, I'm supposed to answer this, right? Okay.
Okay. All right. So thank you very much, Sir Christian, for giving your response to the commentaries provided by our panelists for this afternoon. Okay, so I just wanted to let the participants know that the one of the innovations of the International Conference on Geographical Studies is the use of Slido as part of our Q&A session. Yeah, so we would like to proceed now to the open forum. There are already 3 questions that came in while our panelists and Sir Christians are discussing their work and also their commentaries. For this year's ICGS, we'll be using Slido, just like what I've mentioned earlier, to facilitate the question and answer portion of the program. We wish to invite our audience to either scan the QR code as shown in the slide deck, or you can open your preferred browser to go to slido.com and then type in our official hashtag for this book forum is Urban Ecologies. Once in Slido, kindly type in your questions, comments, or reactions on the presentation. But I wish to remind our participants that we only have 160 characters per question. So if you have long questions, maybe you could continue writing those questions in the next thread. Okay. We will go through the items that you will share in Slido during this open forum. So there are already 3 questions, 2 coming from me and 1 from an anonymous member of the audience. Just one question coming, 2 questions actually coming from me. I'd like to give a context of these questions. So, Sir Christian, much of your writings, which is also evident in one of the arguments of your book, focuses on diverting excessive storm waters from the city, which is referred to Metro Manila, to the Laguna Lake, which effectively displaced communities, submerging them to floods, and being subjected to territorialization and even re-territorialization of risks as evidenced by state interventions to address flooding in the lake. So the questions are, how would geographic lens would help rethink solutions to address flooding, given the narratives unraveled in your years of research in the area? And what are your thoughts of the government's move to revive old plans, mostly commissioned by JICA, in addressing flooding surrounding the Laguna Lake? So, sir, you can address one by one, or you can address both. It's up to you, po.
Okay, thanks, CJ, for these questions. I think, yeah, so they're kind of related, but the first question, perhaps the most significant contribution of a geographic lens would be kind of thinking about space and scale. So if you look at how flood control infrastructure and look back to its history, how it has developed in Metro Manila, for instance, you can see how it's very much tied to images, understanding of particular space and at particular scale. So in one of the chapters, I kind of looked at how from localized piecemeal projects in esteros of Manila, the urban administrators increasingly recognized the need to expand the scale of flood control infrastructure development to include, Marikina River, upper Marikina River watershed and Laguna Lake. So that's perhaps one example of how kind of focus on space and scale would matter in thinking about the development of urban flood control infrastructure in Metro Manila. And regarding the second question, so this has been brought up time and time again. So most specifically during times of floods. So for example, the original plan in the case of Laguna Lake was, so you have the Mangahan floodway, which connects Laguna Lake with Manila Bay via Pasig and Napindan rivers. So that one got built in the 1980s, but the other plan was also to connect Manila Bay and Laguna Lake via the Parañaque spillway. So that's another infrastructure that remained unbuilt, but has constantly been brought up as a way to solve problems in Laguna Lake and Metro Manila flooding. And then you also have another proposal to connect Laguna Lake with the Pacific Ocean, Philippine Sea via an underground spillway. So all these things are always brought up. So I think one of the things that perhaps limits these plans, that the reliance on hard infrastructure to solve these problems. And that kind of, and one of the problems with that, as we have seen in the case of Andoy, was when Mangahan floodway was built, people eventually settled in the area because that became dry, and the area used to be flooded. But when it constructed infrastructure, then that led to people settling in, and of course, creating more risk for those who live there. So I think infrastructural solutions to problems will never always work, but they are attractive to the government specifically because they're very visible. You can see them. They're well funded. Um, it's all in the case of recent administrations. It's a symbol of political will. So there is also kind of political power in building infrastructure. But again, it's definitely not the only solution. And I think the work of Tin and others would also say the same thing about the limitations of building urban infrastructure, urban flood control infrastructure, and also not to say about the dispossession, evictions that go along with these projects. And for the third question, EJ, tuloy ka na rin. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah,
So wait, no, sir. Just it also resonates. I think your response actually resonates to a follow-up question I would like to ask. Regarding where do you think this kind of framing is coming from? That the only solution to flooding is to focus more on engineering solutions, like for example, putting up infrastructure so that to lessen the impact of hazards, blah blah blah. So, where do you think, Sir Christian, is this framing coming from, in that sense, based on your work?
Yeah, well, part of it perhaps would be kind of the history of the development of how we understand hazards and flood risk in the first place. So historically, we have seen how engineering solutions, infrastructural solutions often are kind of the dominant solutions to these problems. And that has carried over in the bureaucracy, for example, who decides about these things tend to prioritize those kinds of interventions, perhaps because of how they were taught, kind of the knowledge associated with flooding in the first place. So that could be one, and of course as what I said earlier, the political effect of these interventions, seeing them in the landscape has a particular power. So which is kind of the opposite from the argument. One of the arguments in urban infrastructure studies is that many of our urban infrastructure remain hidden, and they only become visible when they break down. But in the case of Metro Manila, I think that's only partly true because many of these hard infrastructure are very visible, and there is kind of an important role played by their very visibility, that we need to see them, that they are functioning and they are taking care of, making sure that these harmful flows of water are eventually efficiently addressed or taken care of, managed in the context of the city.
Thanks so much, Sir Christian, for addressing those questions. We have one last question coming from our audience. And I think our discussants could also answer this question, since the question is pretty much related to your respective research interests. For those who wish to work on research in line with yours, what do you think is the future of doing urban studies research here in the Philippines, considering your work in Laguna Lake and, of course, in connection to Metro Manila and resource governance and all that?
Yes, I think, thank you for this question. I think there's a lot of opportunity in doing urban studies, and urban studies is actually a very interdisciplinary field. So you can approach it from a variety of perspectives. So it's what I've found also in my own experience, that it's a very welcoming field in a way. They don't police what counts as urban studies or not. So it's you could come in with whatever you're interested in and kind of engage with the questions of urban, and that would be a good contribution to urban studies research. So historically, in the Philippines, most urban studies research have focused on the informal settlements. You can find a lot of research on that. There's a long history of that in the Philippines. But increasingly, you can see kind of it branching out and expanding. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to do urban research in the Philippines, and beyond the things that we kind of usually do has been done, and also beyond kind of the more common methods and frameworks that are being used. So going back to what Marvin was talking about surprises, I think there's also a lot of element of surprise that could be unpacked if you do urban studies research. So just ask questions beyond what has been asked, or approach these common questions in a different way. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to expand urban studies research, and we've been seeing a lot of work being done by many of our Filipino scholars, in particular on questions of the urban.
Thanks, Sir Christian. Are there any thoughts on this question coming from our panelists?
I think maybe I'll add to Christian's comment. I echo what he's saying about how really there's a lot of promise and there's a lot of openness as well in urban studies. We have an urban studies program here, and I find it quite interesting that I actually interact a lot with them, because they also do a lot of stuff in the environmental studies area, but they're all kind of examined and framed under urban studies. And I think one of the things that I noticed is that, as what Christian said, there's a lot of openness to it. I mean, there are canons, right? I mean, it depends on which school of thought you're coming from. You know, if for example you're coming from the U.S., there's kind of an expectation of you being familiar with certain urban studies, bodies of literature that's associated with urban challenges in the U.S. But I think that the exciting part is that because it's an emerging field, and many people are kind of coming in with its openness. Many people are coming into the field, drawing from their knowledge and experience of coming from the fields where they're coming from, right? There's a lot that they're bringing into urban studies research, right? So there's a lot of like this opportunity to create new knowledge in that sense. So like, for example, I identify myself as largely, doing environmental studies and rural studies, but then as what Christian said, it's sometimes it's quite inevitable for you to do work in the urban area as well. So increasingly I'm finding myself, interacting a lot with urban scholarship, and at least from my perspective, I'm bringing in stuff from environmental studies in conversation with the extant literature in urban studies, and there's a lot of opportunity there from what I've been hearing from urban scholars, and the same as well. My interaction with urban scholarship, I'm bringing a lot of scholarship and theories from their field, which I find really quite useful in environmental studies too.
If I could also add to what Christian and Marvin have shared, I do think that a lot of the most interesting work that's being done on the question of cities or the idea of the urban are also coming from scholars in allied disciplines such as sociology, anthropology, and history. And I also think it's like echoing Christian's point earlier. I think this is a vibrant time for urban geography, for urban studies in general, because we have a lot of newly minted PhDs and PhD students who are coming home and trying to interact more, trying to bring the things that they have learned. And I think, but I think what's important to highlight here is the kind of urban scholarship that we need. And this is also something that I picked up from Christian. I remember, I think this was like 4 years, probably 4 years ago. And he mentioned one thing that really stuck with me, and it's that not all urban studies is critical urban studies. And to me, that's the kind of urban scholarship that we should bring, because actually there's a lot of conversations that are happening about the kinds of cities that we desire, the kinds of cities that we envision. Or there's also a lot of talk about our hopes for the urban, but a lot of the dreams, a lot of the aspirations, a lot of these imaginaries need to be critically unpacked and interrogated. And that's why I think the work of ICGS, of the Department of Geography and UP, and like especially like folks like Christian, is really important, because there has to be that we have to make a distinction between that. I personally don't think that we need more urban studies. What I think we need specifically is more critical, more radical urban scholarship.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
Tin,
much.
for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And also would like to add perhaps where to locate urban studies. I think one of the point of the book is to try to decenter what we mean when we talk about the urban, to move beyond just the city. And I think there's a lot of exciting work also being done, especially in kind of the peripheries, the peripheral, the edge. And yeah, according to one urban scholar that I admire a lot, he said that a lot of the more interesting things happening in the city are actually happening along the edge in urban, where all these developments happening. So I think there's also an opportunity to kind of move beyond our traditional notion of urban as just the downtown or the core of the city, and into kind of these other spaces in the urban. And okay, thanks, TJ. Can I? Yeah,
All right, sir.
I can answer the other questions.
Oh, sure, sir. This
Yeah,
this question is for yeah. If there's one thing that government should take away from your book, what would that be?
Yeah, so well, in the book, I kind of talk a lot about how the state screwed up, kind of the ways that the state kind of functions in the context of all these problems that we have been encountering. So if I'm going to wear kind of a government planner's hat, I would probably say to recognize kind of the connections between places. And I think that's a bit more difficult to do, but also something that perhaps contribution of geography, kind of looking at connections of places. So when you plan, for example, the city, it's not just planning a specific location, but you need to recognize kind of their interconnections with other places. In the same way, for rural planning, in the case of Laguna Lake, you could also need to recognize its connections with the city. And that also links with perhaps the next question on gap in urban ecologies. I think that is related to that as well. It's kind of seeing how when you talk about urban environment, it's not just environments in place, but also kind of multiple scales of urban environments. And even we can link that to kind of the scale of the global in terms of how, for example, changes in the climate are shaping local urban environments. So I think that's an important thing to consider as well. And for that last question, necessary skills and traits. So I think, yeah, I would, perhaps a lot of this would go back to what also Tin was saying about how urban studies need to also be critical urban studies. And I think that's one of the contributions of urban political ecology, to emphasize the relational political production of urban environments. That the environments that we see are not just kind of physical and material, but are a product of a history, a product of uneven relations through time and manifesting in space. So I think sensitivity to kind of this way of thinking about urban environments is perhaps the most important skill that you need to have if you want to delve into urban political ecology. So being critical, recognizing that urban environments are beyond merely physical or are always political in nature. So I think that's one of the key traits. And also a lot of, perhaps if from a practical perspective, drawing from a lot of disciplines would also help, since many of these work tend to be interdisciplinary. So yeah, recognizing that, going beyond your own field, perhaps.
All right. So thank you very much, Sir Christian. Okay, so there's one question that just arrived. Maybe this is the last question we can accommodate so that we can end on time, which is at 6 in the evening. How can we make the motion of urban metabolism be more approachable, especially to people who are not familiar with the discipline?
Yes, yeah. So the urban metabolism, of course, as a concept, is inherently slippery, and it's not very it's very difficult to kind of translate. For example, um, there is kind of a metaphor associated with it, kind of an organicist biological metaphor, like our body metabolizes food. So in the same way, you could think of the city as that. So that's one way of thinking about urban metabolism. So, for example, industrial ecologists, engineers, physical scientists, they try to measure the input and the output so that you can have a more sustainable city. So that's how metabolism is understood in that context. But you can also, applying on urban political ecology perspective, more critical perspective, we can also see that metabolism is a process of transformation involving flows of materials and stuff, are also historical, political, relational, and we also need to understand why is this such the case. Why do we have this particular movement of flows, whether it be water, waste, food? Yeah, so I think that the challenge would be trying to perhaps translate that to a way to understand the city in a perhaps more approachable manner. So yeah, perhaps the metaphor, kind of the biological metaphor, still has use because it's very easy to understand, the input and output of flows that you need in order for us to survive. The same way you can apply to cities, but also add the important element that these processes are inherently political, that it benefits some at the expense of others, involves state, capital, and all these sorts of things.
Thank you very much, Sir Christian. There's this one question from the chat box. But in the interest of time, I think if we could address that through our chat box, it would be very much appreciated. So I just wanted to thank our panelists, Tin Alvarez and Dr. Marvin. Dr. Marvin Montefrio for being with us this afternoon and for sharing your insights about Dr. Sagin's book. And we are so happy to be for you to be here in this book forum. So thank you very much. And also congratulations to my former thesis advisor, Sir Christian. I remembered this is one email I sent to Sir Christian, and I was very much worried about. I was writing my thesis on the right to the city in the RR practice, and I was asking him, is San Mateo Rizal, which is, by the way, located at the urban peripheries, would be counted as the city? But he told me that urban is something that is not only within the premise of the city, but also it goes beyond the core and the downtown and stuff like that. So it's also very much evident in the urbanization of nearby areas in nearby areas that surround Metro Manila as we see it. So thank you very much again, Sir Christian, for we hope to
Thanks,
hear from
DJ.
you very, very soon. All right, so just
Yes.
wanted to sir, would
Yeah,
you like to say
before we
something?
end, yeah. So if you're interested in the book, it's currently still available via Amazon or the UC Press website, University of California Press. But yeah, just like what Marvin mentioned, we hope to have some local version of the book in the near future. But if you're interested, let me know if you can't find a copy, and yeah, we'll find a way to have have it brought to the Philippines. And thank you all. Thank you again, Marvin, and Tin, DJ, Emma, and then all of you for attending this book forum / book launch. Sorry, DJ, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Sir Christian. Okay, so as we wrap up the open forum, I would like to thank our speakers, Dean Alvarez and Dr. Marvin Jose Montrefillo, and of course, Dr. Christian Sagin for being with us in the culmination of the International Conference on Geographical Studies 2021. Yeah, so thank you all for sharing with us your work on the intersections of political ecology and urban and environmental studies. To show our appreciation, the Philippine Geographical Society would like to give a certificate of appreciation to our speakers. So first is a certificate of recognition to Dr. Christian Carlos Sagin for the successful publication of their book entitled Urban Ecologies on the Edge, Making Manila's Resource Frontier, given this 11th of November 2022 at the International Conference on Geographical Studies 2022 with the theme Emotional Geography's Passion in the Geographical, held virtually at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, Quezon City, Philippines, signed by yours truly and Fernan Francis Hermoso, your ICGS 2022 coordinators. Professor Emmanuel B. Garcia, President of the Philippine Geographical Society, and Dr. Joseph Palis, Chair of the UP Department of Geography. And also, I would like to, sorry, apologies for that sound. Like also to give these certificates of appreciation first to Maria Christine or Tin Alvarez for their contribution as discussant during the book forum entitled Urban Ecologies on the Edge, Making Manila's Resource Frontier at the International Conference on Geographical Studies 2022 with the theme Emotional Geography's Passion in the Geographical, held virtually on November 11, 2022 at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, Quezon City, Philippines. Signed by yours truly and Fernan Francis M. Hermoso, your ICGS 2022 coordinator, Professor Emmanuel B. Garcia, President of the Philippine Geographical Society, and Dr. Joseph Palis, Chair of the UP Department of Geography. And also, we would like to give this certificate of appreciation to Dr. Marvin Jose Montrefillo for their contribution as discussant during the open forum of Urban Ecologies on the Edge, Making Manila's Resource Frontier at the International Conference on Geographical Studies 2022 with the theme Emotional Geography's Passion in the Geographical, held on November 11, 2022 at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, Quezon City, Philippines. Signed by yours truly and Fernan Francis M. Hermoso, your ICGS 2022 coordinator, Professor Emmanuel B. Garcia, the President of the Philippine Geographical Society, and lastly, Dr. Joseph Paris, Chair of the UP Department of Geography. So once again, thank you so much to our panelists and to Dr. Sagin for being with us and for sharing your insights. And congratulations again on your newly published books. Thank you. All right, so before we go, I would like to invite